So we are continuing on in our series of Luke, chapter 6 now. And our topic today is the topic of the Sabbath. And as I was thinking about this, I was thinking about the fact that this is not really something that is in our culture today. I was doing a little bit of research, and really it's been in the last probably 150 years that the idea of Sabbath has become less and less important in the Christian church. But I was thinking about this and thinking about the fact that Luke himself, the author of the book of Luke, did not grow up with the Sabbath as part of his practice. He was a Gentile, and in fact his audience was Gentile. And so I was asking myself, why would Luke tell multiple stories about the Sabbath and about Jesus dealing with Sabbath-type issues in his book? And not just the stories we're telling today, but there are more in the book of Luke as well. I was also thinking about the fact that of the 10 commandments, the fourth commandment on keeping the Sabbath is the only one that is not explicitly repeated in the New Testament. And wondering, what does that mean? And we're going to see today that Jesus actually went to a lot of effort to recover the true meaning of the Sabbath. And if it was on its way out, why would he have done that? And it begs the question, what does it mean for us today? So these are just all questions that were kind of wandering around in my mind as I was working on preparing for tonight. And so as we go through, we will look at some of these. But basically, we're going to look at two stories today. Verses 1 to 5 is a short story, and it ends with the idea that the Sabbath has a Lord, someone who's in charge, someone who determines what it should look like. The Sabbath also has a purpose. We're going to see that in the second story. And then we're going to, after going through those stories, we're going to look a little bit about, does the Sabbath have a role for us today? And if so, what might that look like? So let's just read these two stories first, and then we'll talk about those three things. So starting in Luke 6, verse 1, on a Sabbath, while he was going through the grain fields, his disciples plucked and ate some heads of grain, rubbing them in their hands. But some of the Pharisees said, "Why are you doing what is not lawful to do on the Sabbath?" And Jesus answered them, "Have you not read what David did when he was hungry, he and those who were with him? How he entered the house of God and took and ate the bread of the presence, which is not lawful for any but the priest to eat, and also gave it to those with him. And he said to them, the Son of Man is Lord of the Sabbath." On another Sabbath, he entered the synagogue and was teaching, and a man was there whose right hand was withered. And the scribes and the Pharisees watched him to see whether he would heal on the Sabbath, so that they might find a reason to accuse him. But he knew their thoughts, and he said to the man with the withered hand, "Come and stand here." And he rose and he stood there. And Jesus said to them, "I ask you, is it lawful on the Sabbath to do good or to do harm, to save life or to destroy it?" After looking around at them all, he said to him, "Stretch out your hand." And he did so, and his hand was restored. But they were filled with fury and discussed with one another what they might do to Jesus. So those are our two stories that we're going to look at today. So first we'll look at the first 5 verses, the idea that the Sabbath has a Lord. So what's happening is Jesus and his disciples are walking along, probably between villages or something like that, and they're going through grain fields, and the disciples are very innocently picking grains of wheat off the stalks, and they're kind of rubbing them in their hands to get the chaff off, and they're eating them. And the Jewish law actually allows for this. That was one of the ways that God provided for the poor. He said that it was your right to go into other people's fields and to, if you needed it, and to pick the grain, not to harvest it for yourself, but to walk through and to pick it and to eat it. But the Pharisees were watching, and they had a problem. They said, what you're doing is not lawful. And what was their problem? Their issue was that they had decided that the disciples were actually working. Now, this was not because they were working according to the law that God had given them, the law that God had given to Moses, but they had actually, God had told them you're not supposed to work on the Sabbath. And so they had gone to great efforts to define exactly what work was. And according to the Pharisees, the disciples were working in at least 4 different ways. Number one, by picking off those little pieces of grain. Officially, they were reaping. That was work. By rubbing the pieces together, that's called threshing. Threshing is separating the wheat from the chaff. And then as that chaff would fall off, that's the process of winnowing, where you take the chaff and you blow wind on it and it blows the chaff away and leaves the grain behind. And then, of course, because they were eating it, all of this was preparing food. So they were working in all these ways, not according to God, but according to their own laws. And so Jesus responds to this. But he doesn't do what I probably would have done. I probably would have said, hey, you've added all these laws, that what they're doing actually is not against God's laws, against your man-made laws. But Jesus didn't do that. Instead, he tells them a story. Why would he tell them a story instead of just saying you're wrong by coming up with all of these laws? I think what he wanted them to do is help them see that they were focusing just on rules. That wasn't what God's intent was. Focusing on rules is not a way to keep the Sabbath or a way to please God in general. Because what does focus on rules do? It helps me either feel good about my performance or feel bad about my performance. And it's not my performance that earns me favor in God's eyes. So he tells them this story, in the story you can go back and read this story in the Old Testament, how David, he was running away from King Saul, and he goes to the temple, and this priest is there, and David asks him for food, and the guy says, the only thing I have is the bread of the presence. And this bread of the presence is described in Leviticus chapter 24, verses 5 to 9. And what happened was that every week they would prepare 12 loaves of bread, and they would bring them in to the holy place and put them before the Lord. And those represented the 12 tribes of Israel. And they would leave that bread for a week before the Lord, and then at the end of the week, they would take that out and replace it with fresh bread. Well, that was the bread that we're talking about here. And the ceremonial law was very clear on this. No one except the priests were allowed to eat this bread because it was consecrated bread. It was special bread. Very clear. But David came, was not a priest in any way, and the priest gave it to him, realizing that there was a higher principle at work, and that was a principle of human need. And Jesus knew that even the Pharisees believed that what David did was right. In fact, if you go back to the Jewish commentaries that were written on the Old Testament before the time of Jesus, there's not a single one that criticizes David for what he did. And so even the Pharisees understood that basically what was happening was that David's human need took precedent over the ceremonial law of God. That the focus was not just on the do's and don'ts of the law, but human need actually needed to be considered as well. And so what's Jesus doing? He's arguing from greater to lesser. He's basically saying, so you know that David actually broke the law, God's law, in order to eat this bread. And you don't have a problem with that, right? And so how much more should it be okay for my disciples to break your man-made laws? They're not breaking any God-made laws because of human need, because they're hungry. Well, what's the point that Jesus was making here? Why does he tell them this? It's because they were focusing just on the rules and they were losing the whole spirit of the law. The whole spirit of the law is the idea of loving God and other people. All throughout the law, that's the spirit of it. And if we're focusing only on the rules, we're missing the point. But Jesus didn't stop there. he then says, the Son of Man is Lord of the Sabbath. Now, this is the second time in the book of Luke that we've seen this title, the Son of Man. Back in chapter 5, what did Jesus say about the Son of Man? 5:24, the Son of Man has the authority on earth to do what? To forgive sin. Who has the right to forgive sin? Only God. Right? Because God is the one who's been sinned against. If someone does something to you, I don't have the right to forgive them on your behalf. You have to forgive them. If someone sins against God, we don't have the right to forgive. Only God does. So in chapter 5, Jesus was claiming to have authority to do what only God can do. And now he's saying the Son of Man is Lord of the Sabbath. What does he mean? Well, it means that the Son of Man, Jesus, has authority over the Sabbath, which means what? He can decide what the Sabbath should look like and what it shouldn't, what's proper and what's not, putting himself in the role of God himself who gave us the Sabbath. So here we see that two different times, one in chapter 5 and then again in chapter 6, Jesus is using this title, the Son of Man, to talk about the fact that he actually is coming with the authority of God himself. So, the Sabbath has a Lord. Jesus is the one, not us, who decides what's proper and what's not on the Sabbath. Then the second story, the Sabbath has a purpose. So, another Sabbath, and clearly both of these stories focus on the Sabbath because they both start out with the fact that it was the Sabbath when this happened. So Jesus is teaching in the synagogue, and there's a man there whose right hand was withered. Luke is the only one who points out that it's his right hand. Luke is a doctor. And if you're familiar with culture here, you know that the right hand is very important. It's the hand that you always greet with. It's the hand that you serve with. If you hand someone a cup of coffee, you serve it with your right hand. Right hand is very important. Well, imagine the shame that this guy is living with, not being able to use his right hand. Someone goes to greet him, all he can do is just kind of hold out his arm. That's what he's been living with. And Jesus sees this. But the scribes and Pharisees want to see if he's going to heal. Now, what are they concerned about? Their law, their man-made law, said that healing was allowed if it was a life and death situation. In other words, you could go to a doctor if it was a life and death situation, but otherwise it was work that was not allowed on the Sabbath. And so they wanted to see what Jesus was going to do. They're not concerned about this man. They're concerned about being able to confront Jesus, being able to catch him in something. So they wanted to find a reason to accuse him. That's what their focus is on. So Jesus knows what they're thinking, and he says to the man, stand up. Jesus actually takes the initiative here to confront the issue head on. In the first story, it was the Pharisees who confronted Jesus, but now Pharisees are just waiting to see what happened. Jesus is now going to confront them. And he asks them a question. He says, what is lawful? Okay, you guys want to focus on the law? That's fine. Let's focus on the law. What is lawful? And then he gives them 4 choices, 4 words in a sense. He says, is it lawful to do good? Well, what did he mean? Doing good in this case would be healing the man, right? Healing the guy's hand. Or is it lawful to do harm? What is harm in this particular instance? It's to refuse to heal the man. Jesus has the power to heal him. To refuse to heal him, Jesus is saying, is actually doing harm. To save life, what does he mean by that? It's the idea of delivering or making someone well. Or to destroy life. In other words, to refuse to do the good that's in your power, to have the power to act, to have the power to do good, but to refuse to do it. So Jesus puts this question to them, what's lawful? How do they respond? They don't. But Jesus is saying by refusing to do good, they're actually doing harm. Sometimes we can get focused on keeping the rules. But we forget that keeping the rules is only half of the law. In addition to that, there's the law of love. There's the law of not just not doing the bad things, but doing the good things as well, right? The purpose of the Sabbath is a time, Jesus is saying, a time to focus on loving God and loving other people, doing good, saving life. He says that's what the Sabbath is for. You've missed the whole thing. If we look in the book of 1 John 3:17 says, if anyone sees his brother in need, yet closes his heart against him, how does God's love abide in him? In other words, it's not enough to just avoid doing the wrong things. When we have a chance to do good and we don't take it, that's also harmful. Jesus is saying that's also breaking the law. Not to mention the fact that these Pharisees are trying to destroy Jesus on the Sabbath. But Jesus says to him, stretch out your hand. And what happens? His hand is restored. And everyone's rejoicing except Pharisees and the scribes, and they're incredibly angry because Jesus has just shown them that they're wrong. But I'd like to this word restored is important because Jesus says, is it proper to do good or to do harm, to save life or destroy it? This word restore in the original Greek is actually the direct opposite of the word to destroy. So what Luke is saying is what Jesus did is the opposite of destroying. By restoring his hand, by restoring his health, it was the opposite of destroying. And so by refusing to do that, Jesus would have been destroying in some sense. So what's the purpose of the Sabbath that we see here in this story? Jesus says the purpose of the Sabbath is to do good, to save life, to restore. It's not just a time to not do certain things. It's a time to give ourselves to things that are life-giving to other people as well. So the Sabbath has a Lord, the Sabbath has a purpose, but what does that mean for us today? Is the Sabbath still relevant? People don't agree on this. Theologians don't agree on this. But I'd like to just look at some passages. I'd like to start with the idea of why did Jesus work so hard to restore the true meaning of the Sabbath if the Sabbath was on its way out? He obviously thought it was important for people to understand the true purpose of the Sabbath. So I'd like to just go through, from the Old Testament, some of the purposes and general principles about the Sabbath, and just kind of put these out in front of us. Let us think about how they might be relevant to us today. The first one, we're just going to kind of go in order of how they appear in the Bible. We're going to start in the Ten Commandments, Exodus chapter 20, verse 10, where God gives the fourth commandment, the seventh day is a Sabbath to the Lord your God. On it you shall not do any work. The Sabbath was for who in this case? It was for God. It was a time for people to give their time to God. Just as God asked them to give a share of their money, a tithe of their money, he was also asking them to give a share of their time to him, 1 day a week. And as we go through these, just think about how it might apply to you. everyone's probably going to apply it a little bit differently because we don't have a system like they did in the Old Testament. But just as we go through these, just ask God, is there a way that this applies to me? We go on to the next verse. Now we have the origins of the Sabbath, why it came about in the first place. In 6 days the Lord made the heavens and the earth, the sea, and all that is in them, and rested on the seventh day. Therefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and made it holy. We have an important principle about the Sabbath here. When was it established? It was established back at the time of creation. What else was established back in the time of creation? The principle of marriage was established back then. Right? So Sabbath, like marriage, was established from the very beginning of time. It wasn't given initially with the law of Moses. It was formalized with the law of Moses, and God made very clear rules about it in the Mosaic law. But the idea of a seventh-day rest goes all the way back to the beginning of creation. We move up to Exodus 31:13. Above all, you shall keep my Sabbaths, for this is a sign between me and you throughout your generations, that you may know that I, the Lord, sanctify you. What does that word mean? It means to set apart, to make special. Why are we different? Why are we special? It isn't because we're any different than anyone else, but it's because of the God who we worship. He's the one who makes us special. So this is a key purpose of the Sabbath, is to remember that God is the one who makes us different. We're not different from anyone else in and of ourselves. But God has taken an interest in us. God has worked on our behalf. I'll summarize these at the end if you're taking notes and not able to keep up here. Exodus 31:17, it's a sign forever between me and the people of Israel that in 6 days the Lord made the heavens and the earth, and on the seventh day he rested and was refreshed. Who was refreshed here? God. How does that work? Okay, we all know that God doesn't need refreshment in the same way. Just because he created the heavens and the earth didn't mean he was tired. He's infinite in his power. The word can mean a couple different things. This word refreshed actually can take the idea of to take a breath or to be refreshed, as it's translated here. But I think the idea here is that God simply ceased from the work of creation. He stopped and he just took the time to enjoy it, to delight in the completed work. And so what can we learn from this? God has given us a Sabbath as a gift, a time for rest and refreshment. It wasn't his intent that we work just continually. It was his intent that mankind works on a cycle and periodically has rest and refreshment. Deuteronomy 5:15, Moses says to the people, remember that you were a slave in the land of Egypt, and the Lord your God brought you out from there with a mighty hand and an outstretched arm. Therefore, the Lord your God commanded you to keep the Sabbath day. What's the connection here? Again, it's remembering. In this case, remembering their slavery and redemption. And God is saying, remember that I'm the one who's redeemed you. In our case, not redeemed us from actual slavery, but redeemed us from sin. The Sabbath is a chance to remember that. Isaiah 58:13-14, if you turn back your foot from the Sabbath, from doing your pleasure on my holy day, call the Sabbath a delight and the holy day of the Lord honorable. If you honor it, not going your own ways or seeking your own pleasure or talking idly, then you shall take delight in the Lord, and I will make you ride on the heights of the earth. Two principles about the Sabbath here. Number one is that God gave it to us for the purpose of our delight. Now, unfortunately, if you look back over the last couple hundred years of history, Sabbath has a very negative meaning. In a lot of places, Sabbath is just focused on what you can't do. And I don't know about you, but I've read lots of stories about, people not being able to have any fun and people, just it being a day that everyone kind of dreads, especially kids. Is that what the Sabbath was supposed to be? God says, no, the Sabbath is supposed to be a day that you delight in. And what else, what other principle can we see here? It's a time to focus on God and others. I can use the Sabbath to make it a special time for my wife. I can use it make it a special time for my kids, for other people in my life. It's not all about what I need to not do. No, the Sabbath is about what I can do, giving me an opportunity when I'm not consumed with all these other things to be able to put into the people in my life and to feed them, to do things that God wants to do for them. This particular verse, Psalm 127, 1 and 2, does not refer to the Sabbath. But I put it in here because I think it's very important. Unless the Lord builds the house, those who build it labor in vain. Unless the Lord watches over the city, the watchman stays awake in vain. It is in vain that you rise early and go late to rest, eating the bread of anxious toil, for he gives to his beloved sleep. What's the picture here? The picture here is people who believe that everything depends on them. Right? That if I'm going to succeed, I got to work hard. I got to stay up late. I got to get it all done. That's the picture that's given here. And what does it say in the end? He gives to his beloved sleep. In other words, there's a time when I can let go and say, God, I need you to cover the rest. The Sabbath is a time to cease our striving, to acknowledge that God is the one actually who has the primary role in our success. And if God doesn't give success, I can work as hard as I can, but it's not going to happen. Last kind of principles here is, what about the New Testament? Those were all from the Old Testament. But what is the Sabbath in the New Testament? Well, no mention is made in the whole New Testament about the Gentile churches following the Jewish Sabbath in the same way that the Jews did. Actually having those same Sabbath laws that the Jews had. There's no mention of that. But there is a mention. The New Testament church seems to have had a practice of gathering on the first day of the week. We see that in Acts 20, verse 7. And in 1 Corinthians 16:2, Paul says, every first day of the week, set aside some money so that when I come, it will be ready. So there was this idea in the New Testament church, the first day of the week, the day of the resurrection, was a special day for them. And by the end of the first century, that day became known as the Lord's Day. John refers to it as the Lord's Day in Revelation 1, verse 10. So that's really what we know about the specific Sabbath in the New Testament. So let's just review kind of what we've seen here. What are some of the important principles of the Sabbath? And how might they apply to us? Well, first of all, it was established at creation. Something set up from the beginning of time. God's intent is that the Sabbath is a gift to us. It's intended to be something that we delight in. It's a time when I don't have to be consumed with all my work. I can focus more on loving God and other people. It's a way to cease my striving and to acknowledge that if God doesn't give me success, that I won't have it. And in the New Testament, the Sabbath practice changed from the Jewish Sabbath to the first day of the week. Now, here in Jordan, it's challenging. Right? Sunday is a normal work day for most of us. What do we do with that? Well, I don't think it necessarily has to be legalistic. It doesn't have to be Sunday or Saturday or a particular day. But I think if we look at these principles, there is an idea of setting aside time for God. What is the purpose, or what are the purposes of the Sabbath? It's God's plan for giving us rest and refreshment. It's for us. It's not intended to keep our lives from being fun or enjoyable or productive. It's a gift to us. It's a way of giving our time to God, kind of like tithing. It's a way of remembering a couple different things. Number one, that God is the one who sets us apart. God is the one who makes us different. God is the one who blesses us. And it's also a way of remembering that God is the one who's redeemed us from slavery to sin. So what do we do with all this? What are some questions that we should consider? For me, I've chosen to take Friday kind of as a day off. And the main thing is that I don't work on sermon preparation on Friday. And let me tell you, that's really nice. I look forward to Fridays. Even if I don't feel like I'm quite ready for Saturday, I look forward to Fridays. But that's just for me. What other types of applications? I was talking to Sunil yesterday, actually, and he was telling me about a guy in the U.S. who owns this large company called Hobby Lobby. They've got stores all over the U.S., multi-billion-dollar business. And they had been operating 7 days a week. But the owner was a strong believer, and he came to the decision that he wanted to close his stores on Sundays. Now, Sunday was actually their biggest day of sales. But he decided that as part of his worship of God, he wanted to close the business on Sunday. And so they couldn't just do it all at once, but they did it in phases, worked their way across the country. And they ended up finally closing all the stores on Sunday, so they were only open 6 days a week. What do you think happened to their business after that? It went up. They ended up with more sales in those 6 days than they had before in 7 days. Now, that was just something that he decided. Did he have to do that? No. But it was something that he did as part of his worship of God, as part of his trust in God. And that's the thing, is that we're people who've been set apart. How does the world know that we're set apart? How does the world know that we trust in God? How did the world know that the people of Israel trusted in God? The idea was that the nations around them would see that they didn't need to work on that seventh day in order to make life work out. In fact, God even asked them to not plant their fields every 7 years. I don't think they ever did that. But that was God's intent, is that their trust in Him would be so great that they would see how He made up the difference, to see how He was truly the one who blessed them. I can't tell you what it means for you, but I would encourage you, if you have not asked this question already, to ask the question, what, if any, role should the Sabbath have in my life? And I would also encourage you to not just ask that question of yourself, but ask that question of the Lord of the Sabbath. Jesus said, I am the Lord of the Sabbath. To say, Jesus, what would you have me do? What does the Sabbath look like? Here we are in 2026, and life is crazy, and Sunday's a work day, and all these things happen, all these other days during the week. What does it really look like for me to set aside time for you? And I think it looks different for every one of us, but I would encourage you, if you haven't asked this question, to ask the question, not be afraid of the answer, because the Sabbath is a gift. God intended it to be for us, not to work against us. All right, let me close in prayer. Lord, we just confess that in our modern society, we have really lost the idea of giving time to you. And we get so consumed in all the things that we have going on. And we don't really know what your intent is for us, for each one of us. But I pray that you would just speak to us and make it clear to each of us as individuals and as families. What does it look like to give you our time? What does it look like to be refreshed? What does it look like to really trust you to be the one who blesses our lives? I pray that you would really help us to ask that question, and that you would help us to hear your voice as you speak to us in answer of that. Lord, I just pray these things in Jesus' name. Amen.